In this video, you and I get to take a moment and discuss why, in the big picture, we love and use the applications and services of MPLS. Let's begin. Here are the opt-out questions for this video, and here's how they work. They're great. We take just a moment, we read through these questions, and if we already know the answers and are comfortable with those topics, we can go ahead and jump right to the next video and maximize our time. Now, if you're not quite yet comfortable with these concepts, have no fear, because you and I are going to cover each of these topics right now. I'd like you to imagine that you and I together are going to build a service provider network. And don't worry, we'll start small. For example, maybe we have just 3 routers, R1, R2, and R3. And we've got some basic connectivity between them, and that makes up our service provider network. Now, I've got a question for you. What does a service provider really need to be successful in business? And one of the answers is we need at least one customer, a paying customer, who's buying our services. So let's say we have customer A. They have site 1, and we have customer A at site 2. And let's say this is on the West Coast, and site 2 is on the East Coast. And because they are geographically separate, but they want to have traffic go back and forth between their 2 sites, they've called upon us and hired us as their service provider to provide that functionality. So we get some connectivity from our network, our service provider network, to the customer network. And let's say that customer A is using the address space of 172.16.0.0/12, which is the RFC 1918 private address space. They're welcome to use that. And let's say over at site 2, they're using 192.168.0.0/16, and anything that falls within that range. Now, as a service provider for this customer, customer A, we need to provide some services, including routing services. So from a education or a learning perspective, routing could imply that we need to make sure that all the devices over at site 1 know how to reach 192.168, which is site 2, and vice versa. We need to make sure that all the devices over at site 2 know how to reach the 172.16 address space at site 1. The second thing we're also going to want to do is forward. We're going to want to forward that traffic so that if somebody at site 1 needs to reach a server at site 2, when they send the packet into our service provider network, we need to do that forwarding of traffic. Now, the actual word switching, we usually reserve that for layer 2 functionality inside of a switch, like a layer 2 switch. But we could also loosely use that as the action item or the action word to represent the process a router is taking as it's forwarding a packet along a path. So depending on who you're talking to or what the context is, these 3 words could be referring to similar functionality. But regardless, as a service provider, we are responsible to our paying customer to provide that functionality between site 1 and site 2. So let's take the next logical step together. Let's say that we do so well with customer A, and our marketing team is doing such a good job of advertising our services that we are starting to get more and more customers that want to use our services. So let's bring in another customer. Let's say we're going to use customer B. And customer B has 2 sites. You'll never guess what those sites are. You got it. Site 1 and site 2. And they've got a router at each of their locations. And we establish some connectivity to their routers, connecting to our service provider network. And let's say customer B is using the 10.1.0.0 address space at site 1. They're using 10.2.0.0/16 over at site 2. And we would need to provide those same types of services for that customer, customer B. The advertising of the 10.1 and 10.2 respectively back and forth. The actual forwarding or switching of the packets between those 2 sites. The other thing that we need to address is what if customer B wants to start using 172.16.0.0/12? Well, the challenge is that address space right there is already in use by customer A, but it is an RFC 1918 address. Customer B is totally within their rights to use that address space, and as a service provider, you and I have to keep this 172.16 address space separate from this 172.16 address space. And here's why. If we have Bob over here at customer B site 2, and he sends a packet to 172.16.0.50, that traffic, that transit traffic, needs to be forwarded over to site 1 of customer B, not to that IP address at site 1 of customer A. So somehow we need to keep that routing information private for each of our customers, so that the results will be customer A will only share routes with other customer A sites, or at least the ones they want to share with, and customer B will only share with other customer B sites. And that brings me to the focal point of this video. Why do we love MPLS, multi-protocol label switching? Why do we use it? Why do we love it? And it's because of the service. Have you ever gone to a restaurant or some other establishment and the service has been so phenomenal, you just can't get over it? You're going to go back, you're going to tell your friends. Well, it's the service or services that MPLS applications provide for us. That's the reason we use it. And one of those MPLS services that we could use for this scenario right here is called MPLS Layer 3 Virtual Private Networks. Now, by using a service like MPLS Layer 3 VPNs for our service provider network, we could do several things. We could keep all of the routing separate between customer A and customer B. We don't want them mingling or sharing each other's networks and routes. By keeping all of the routing separate or private from each other, then when Bob sends a packet to 172.16 something, it'll be going over to site 1 of customer B and not site 1 of customer A. So from a routing perspective, it's kept private. I'm going to put per customer here in our scenario. Now, if Bob is sending a packet over to site 1, and we have Lois up here who is sending a packet up to some device on her site 1, from customer A's perspective, I want you to take a look at R2 in our topology. From a service provider, our router, R2, guess what? It's carrying all of that traffic. It's carrying Lois's traffic going to site 1 and Bob's traffic going to customer B site 1. The reality is we don't have a separate physical network for each of our customers. But what we are doing is we are emulating or virtualizing, if you will, a logical network just for customer B and a separate logical network just for customer A. So let's you and I put ourselves in the customer's shoes just for a moment. If we are customer A, all we know about are the routes at our remote site and our local site. That's it. We don't know anything about customer B and vice versa. So from the customer perspective, customer A has their own, what they think, their own network between site 1 and site 2. While at the same time, customer B thinks they have their own network from site 1 to site 2. In reality, we're sharing the service provider network, including R2 forwarding all that traffic for both paths. So effectively, we virtualized our networks. We have a set of networks for customer A and another set of networks for customer B. And from a customer point of view, they are separate from each other. So if you have these virtual networks that are private from each other, for example, customer A and customer B, you could say that is a virtual private network. And that's what the VPN refers to in Layer 3 VPNs, virtual private networks. So one of the first things I want you to be aware of with this virtual private network as a Layer 3 VPN MPLS service or MPLS application is that it's not focused on cryptography. It's not focused on IPsec. Because that's what a lot of people think about when they see VPN. Oh, it must be running IPsec or SSL or some kind of encryption. No. The VPN in MPLS Layer 3 VPNs is all about creating these virtual networks, a set for customer A and a completely different set for customer B. That's the virtual networking part. And because they are separate and private from each other, that's the private portion. Simply because they are not shared or intermingled between customer A and customer B. They are private and separate from each other. Here's an example of a topology that's using MPLS Layer 3 VPNs. Again, that's just one of the many services that we could use that MPLS makes possible. So here we have Acme at site 1 and Acme at site 2. We've got CBT at site 1 and CBT at site 2. At site 1, Acme is using this address space, and at site 2, they're using this address space. And CBT, at their site 1, they happen to be using the same exact address space, and it's our responsibility as a service provider to make sure all that routing information keeps separate, or private, if you will, between those two customers. We don't want those routes accidentally to be mixed up between the two different customers. The other really cool benefit from an MPLS Layer 3 VPN solution is that inside of our core network, we don't have to have a physical network, one just for Acme, and we don't have to have another physical network just for CBT, and that's because we're virtualizing it. So logically, the traffic can flow through the network from site 1 of Acme to site 2 of Acme, and from site 1 of CBT to site 2 of CBT, but at the same time, we're going to separate the routing information and the forwarding information between Acme and CBT. And the cool thing about using a solution, an application like MPLS Layer 3 VPNs, is that it's very scalable. The other reality is we don't have to be a service provider to use it. We could just be a large enterprise network. We could have multiple sites, and we want to choose which sites have routing information and capability between the other sites. We could also implement that as an enterprise network for sites within our own company. All right, my friend, here's the action item I'd like you to do for this video. I'd like you to go back to the beginning of this video, take a look at those opt-out questions, and make sure you are comfortable in answering those questions now that we've taken a look at the content together. I have had a great time, and I'm glad that you joined me. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.